Russia's President Vladimir Putin has threatened serious consequences if Western countries allow Ukraine to use Western weapons to strike targets in Russia. So far, most of Kyiv's Western suppliers have said their arms cannot be used to hit targets on Russian soil. But France's President Emmanuel Macron said this should be allowed in some cases. Washington has ruled out such a possibility for US weapons. The debate is intensifying as Russian forces appear to be gaining ground in eastern Ukraine.
Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, in the country's northeast. In recent weeks, increasingly a target of Russian attacks. Russia also claims it has made territorial gains in the Kharkiv region, which borders Russia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has warned Russia is preparing an offensive against Kharkiv. He says restrictions on Western weapons are crippling Kyiv's ability to defend itself.
They can fire any weapon from their territory at ours. That's the biggest advantage that Russia has. But we can't do anything to their systems, which are located on Russian territory, with Western weapons. We don't have that right.
But now NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg is calling on members to lift those restrictions. He says Ukraine should be allowed to use Western weapons to attack positions inside Russia.
Some allies have lifted restrictions, other allies have not. My message is that I think we should now consider those restrictions, because by having too many restrictions, we are tying one hand of the Ukrainian armed forces on their back, because they're reducing their capability to defend themselves.
The United States has already sent Ukraine its ATACMS long-range missiles, seen here in file footage, with a range of up to 300 kilometers. Lifting restrictions would allow Ukraine to hit targets such as any troop buildup in the Belgorod region, where Russia is believed to be building an airbase. Kyiv would also be able to attack supply lines to Russian-controlled Crimea, which are seen as critical for the Kremlin's war effort. On a recent visit to Kyiv, British Foreign Secretary David Cameron said Ukraine could use weapons provided by London any way it sees fit, including inside Russia. But other partners, including Germany, are so far unwilling to grant Ukraine that permission, fearing it could increase the risk of direct confrontation with Moscow.
I'm now joined by our correspondent Roman Goncharenko in Kyiv. Roman, how is this debate being viewed in Ukraine?
Well, it is a very important, it's a survival issue actually for Ukraine. That's how it's being debated, because Ukraine has been asking its Western partners to have that possibility to strike Russia proper with Western weapons from the very beginning of the Russian invasion in 2022. And the answer was always no, because the West was fearing escalation and was trying to avoid even a small chance of it. So Russia was very, very aggressive at that time, threatening with nuclear weapons. It's doing the same now as well. Just remember a few days those nuclear drills with tactical nuclear weapons. But what's really new now is that Ukraine is being very vocal about it, asking Western partners, putting more pressure on the United States, on other allies and partners in Western world to allow to strike Russia proper. And the reason is Ukraine is in a much weaker position now than it was just half a year ago. Its army is exhausted. There is not enough ammunition, not enough weapons. And Russia is building up forces in the north, in the Kharkiv region, as you've just heard in the report. And there is a growing fear here in Ukraine that Russia might start a multiple attack in summer.
Now, Ukraine repeatedly attacks fuel depots and military airports in Russia. What kind of weapons does Ukraine use there?
Well, there is not much information, at least official information about that. Ukraine has been targeting critical infrastructure like refineries, and it has also been targeting, reportedly, military targets like airfields. What's interesting, those targets were hundreds of miles away from the Russian-Ukrainian border. So Ukraine was using mostly Soviet equipment. For long distance attacks on Russian military airfields, it used Soviet-style drones. It used also smaller, modern drones, own Ukrainian manufactured drones. When we talk about the Black Sea, Ukraine is using completely its own developments, and those sea drones in the Black Sea were very effective in the past months against the Russian Black Sea fleet.
Now, Ukraine says it does not get enough weapons. You've just touched upon this. What's the situation on the front line at the moment?
Well, I would say the pressure is slowly growing on the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian forces. We have reports this morning from the Ukrainian military officials that Russia was able to have some small territorial gains in the region of Donetsk towards the city of Pokrovsk. There is also continued fierce fighting in the north, Russian-Ukrainian border, Kharkiv region, in the town of Chansk, which is very close to the border, where Russian forces were able to advance a few weeks ago, and Ukrainians are trying to hold them back to regain some positions, but it is still, the situation is still, can be described that the Ukrainian forces are outgunned and outnumbered.
Roman Goncharenko there reporting from Kyiv. Thank you very much, Roman.
And Ben Hodges is a retired US Lieutenant General and the former commander of US forces in Europe. And he joins me now in the studio. Welcome back to DW News. So it's a pleasure to have you with us. Can we start with this pressure that is building to allow Ukraine to use Western weapons to strike Russia, including, obviously, weapons from the US? Can I ask you for your take on that?
Well, of course, it's overdue. There's no legal or moral or military reason to restrict Ukraine from using weapons for attacking targets on the other side of the Russian border. And I think that there's a growing recognition among European leaders that if Ukraine fails, that Europe is going to be confronted with a Russian attack against NATO countries. So it's much better to do this now rather than have to confront it down the road, which they will have to do. And there's also a humanitarian part of this. I mean, they don't want to be seen as standing by as every day Ukrainian civilians are murdered by Russian artillery strikes.
So can and should the US give any ground here? Do you think that's likely?
I think it's eventual. And that's the way this has gone the last 2 years, is because the administration, the Biden administration, which has done well on so many aspects of this, has failed the critical task of laying out the strategic objective. You therefore end up with policies that are not connected to an end state. And so it seems like the overriding concern is don't provoke Russia. And that's why we are where we are. And I think it's terrible policy, bad strategy.
Which brings me very nicely to my next question, because, of course, those who are against allowing Ukraine to use Western weapons to strike Russia worry about escalation. We've heard President Putin suggesting that Western countries need to be careful about what it all might lead to. How seriously should that be taken?
Well, of course, you have to take them seriously because they have thousands of nuclear weapons and because they clearly don't care how many innocent people are killed, including their own. So it won't be a moral decision by the Kremlin, but I think there's almost zero chance that they would use a nuclear weapon because there's no benefit to them to use a nuclear weapon. The real benefit for Russia with their nukes is when they threaten the use, because they see how we hesitate, we deter ourselves. I think it's extremely unlikely that they would use a nuclear weapon. Still, I can't dismiss it, but I see no likelihood that they would actually do it.
Mm-hmm. If we can talk about what is actually happening in Ukraine right now, it is a critical time, especially vulnerable given Russia's recent push along the front lines, particularly in the northeast. We know that the troops are depleted. What do you make of where things stand right now?
I think it's important to keep in context where we are after 10 years of war. With Russia having every advantage, they still only control about 19% of Ukraine. They have not been able to significantly exploit any of their tactical successes like Bakhmut last year or Avdiivka back in February. They've barely advanced a few kilometers beyond these places. What they're doing now, of course, is they're pushing their massed infantry against Ukrainian defenders along in the vicinity of Kharkiv. But it's clear to me that Russia does not have the ability to knock Ukraine out of the war. They don't possess that kind of capability. So their only hope is to try to overwhelm Ukrainian defenders with artillery and infantry attacks, and wait for us to stop supporting Ukraine. I think that's really their only hope. So when people are dooming like, oh my God, Ukraine is losing, like, well, wait a minute. They went 6 months without getting any ammunition from us, and the Russians could not even take advantage of that.
Okay. Can I ask you your view on Germany's long-held position on Taurus cruise missiles? Chancellor Scholz has refused to provide Kyiv with them because he says they could potentially reach Moscow. What do you think?
Well, of course, they can't reach Moscow. I think this is a bad policy decision by the Bundeskanzler. I think it's tied to his concern that Germany does not have a nuclear weapon like France and the UK do. And he's probably worried that if there's a Trump administration, that Germany would be without any sort of nuclear guarantee or deterrent. And so he's extra hesitant. But I think Germany is going to be confronted soon if Ukraine fails. They're going to be confronted with millions more Ukrainian refugees coming into Germany. And they're going to be confronted with a Russian army that, if it is successful, will absorb hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops. So it's in Germany's best interest that Ukraine defeats Russia in Ukraine.
Retired US Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for the privilege.